Good afternoon and welcome to Martini's Eco and Country Bites. Today I am doing sorry an interview with WA Icon, a gentleman that came to Australia back in 1965 and blessed us with his skills and his talent to bringing stories to WA. Um, I will be interviewing today the amazing Barry Green, who is an institution and an icon in WA. He's been involved in the Donnybrook Bailing Up Community Radio, which is 102.1 FM radio station, as well as the Western Tourist Radio, which is 87.6 FM, and that's connecting tourists to community here in WA. So, Barry, welcome to the show. And we're going to have some great conversations today about your journey, your background, your history to do with agriculture, traveling and living all over WA, and incredible wisdom that you have gained along the way. I think that your stories are remarkable, and I know that by so many people that have had interviews from you, they are very grateful for giving a platform to community in WA, regional communities especially. And that's something that I myself have been very grateful for when we first did the interview with you, the lovely Suzanne and myself for Save Our Beloved Geograph Bay. So welcome, Barry. Great to finally have this conversation.
Thanks, Martine. Yeah, it's I'm inspired by storytelling, and Aboriginal culture, cultural and corporate knowledge, and ecological knowledge has been passed down through storytelling, and that's why it's so important. Unfortunately, in our culture, the storytelling's been taken over by the advertising executives of the major corporations, and mostly delivered by my old employer, Commercial Television, and that's got us to where we are. But we're in such an interesting time in history, Martine, with the internet. Throughout history, information has been controlled by kings and queens, bishops and dictators, and more recently Rupert Murdoch. But the internet's changed that, and we can have these conversations, and in the regen ag space, regenerative agriculture, the internet's allowed innovative farmers to work with independent scientists and creating much better outcomes, because all agriculture has been impacted the same way as the sickness industry, in that the research has all been done by corporations selling stuff. And in the case of agriculture, it's all been, selling pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers. When we work with Mother Nature and we have the science now to understand more how that works, we get a better outcome with less input. Exciting times.
Yeah, and your background in horticulture came passed on from your father and exposure to that. Is that what you feel, Barry? You were obviously intrinsically it's part of who you are, but being exposed to that at a young age probably would have been something truly amazing, I would think, for a kid.
Well, my grandfather was a market gardener in England, and Dad had studied horticulture after the war, after he got shot and left for dead in the Second World War. So he studied horticulture and then moved to Australia, and they bought an orchard in Donnybrook, and I battled on the orchard for 9 or 10 years. But that's where I grew up, and I guess I sort of the interest was in agriculture, but my interest was in tech. I trained as a radio tech in the Department of Aviation, so I've sort of been part of a government system, and at that stage, that's in 1974 I started, and in those days the Australian government saw its position as training young people for the future. And so I trained with the Department of Aviation, ABC, PMG, OTC were all training techs. Got away from that now. We just don't seem to bother about. We train people who make coffee, but we don't seem to train people who do stuff anymore. So I don't know where that goes. Anyway,
I think I couldn't agree probably more. Sometimes where you just think also about thinking critically and realizing that education is not through indoctrination through organized institutions, that it's by even through some of the sources of interviews that you've done, remarkable information and has come to light. And this is what, I see more and more coming to the surface, is that there are so many experts out there that live and breathe things every day. And they're doing it because they genuinely care and feel that sense of stewardship for land and for community. So I think that interviewing you was a part of our journey. I know that we crossed paths absolutely a way back. I was almost 10 months ago now, I think. It was back in March. Wow, can't believe it. So what do you feel, because we had this conversation the other day and we're talking about how agriculture and WA has really descended into a very fragmented aspect of what it was, and how strong we used to have communities that felt very empowered, and we've come a long way from that. What would you sort of like to kick off to have those discussions and conversation about, community agriculture and the implementation or the lack of using that wisdom from those that were here before us and have been managing this land in a way that was very ecological, as far as sustainable, as well as really, really intuitive, what's called ecological literacy, where they knew how to read the land correctly. And that's a skill that we've talked about that people have lost.
Well, I think now Aboriginal people had it, but the way they managing the Australian landscape only supported about 1 million people. So, while we've got lots to learn from them, we've also got to recognise with more people we've got to do things different. And this is what Charles Massey's book called The Reed Warbler, A New Agriculture, A New Earth was all about. And Alana McTiernan, when she was WA Agriculture Minister, brought Charlie to WA in 2018. And I produced a community radio documentary in 2018 with Charles and others, and that's played on community radio. And in that, just interviewing Charles, and Charlie was a high school student. He's a university student. The young bloke, 22-year-old. The old man got sick and he went back to the farm, and he managed the farm, and he was obviously very intelligent bloke, and he was very involved in the wool industry. In 2009, I think he went back to Australian University to do a PhD in human ecology. So that bringing ecology and agriculture together. Mm-hmm. And he talked about so many things. But in that interview, he raised the subject of glyphosate, which I hadn't expected to go down that path. He said, glyphosate. Yeah. I said, well, he said, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and it's been found in mother's milk, and none of this sounds very good. So I made the observation of, well, that's interesting, because in the case of tobacco, people chose to consume that product, but we're all consuming glyphosate and don't know it. And he said, well, that's interesting. He said, what happened? The tobacco industry pretty much perfected the playbook of they don't deny anything, they just sow that. And that's how they operate. So for years and years, blind Freddie could see that smoking was causing lung cancer, but they say, no, there's no proof, so it doesn't exist. And the chemical industry does the same thing, and the pharmaceutical industry is doing exactly the same thing right now. And so that sort of helped me to understand things when the COVID con started. And then the other thing he talked about was nitrogen fertilizer. And we only started using artificial nitrogen fertilizer in agriculture after the Second World War. And that came about because the big corporations had these nitrogen plants to make nitrogen for explosives. And I said, shit, what are we going to do with these things? I know what we'll do. We'll bring the markers in, we'll remarket it as fertilizer. And you chuck nitrogen fertilizer on, stuff flies out of the ground. There's no two ways about it. But, that's not how things are supposed to happen. And it's what Charles calls, the whole green revolution, which various people got Nobel Prizes for. That's what's contributed to all this. And it's created a dependency by agriculture on these corporate inputs. And it's a bit unfortunate, because what's happened, we've been sort of farming organically on a small scale for 30 odd years. And the term organic, a lot of people, there's this notion that organic farmers is the loony left and the hippies and all that sort of thing. But if you understand the term organic agriculture, the origins of it pertains to the organic matter in the soil. And
Exactly.
what's happened in agriculture with lots of ploughing and artificial fertilizers, the organic matter in the soil has gone from 6 or 7% down to 1 or 2%. Now,
Mm.
that organic matter, if it's not in the soil, it's in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Organic matter is carbon.
Mm.
So organic agriculture is all about building carbon in the soil as organic matter. And
Mm-hmm.
that has multiple effects. One is that if you increase the soil organic matter content by 1%, that increases the water holding capacity of the soil, something like 140,000 litres per hectare. So that's
Mm.
more water held, so the droughts start later. But also the biology, it's the food for the biology. And,
Mm.
and organic or regenerative agriculture is about working with Mother Nature, not beating her over the head with a stick, and supporting
Yeah.
that biology. And that's how food's grown. That's how plants are grown for millennium. It's
Mm.
only since the Second World War that we've become dependent on these
Mm.
corporations that are making us sick at the same time.
Well, I think across the board, if you look down, it's a top-down dictatorship of how things are going to be implemented in our society, in our communities. We talked about this previously. I mean, it's the same with fluoride, and fluoride that is put into our water without our consent, again, is a waste product from the mining industry. And so you've got to stop
It's
and question.
specifically it's specifically taken out of superphosphate. We don't want to put it on
Mhm.
farmland, so we take it out of superphosphate and then we dump it in the water. Go figure that. It's a very inefficient
So
way of doing it.
totally.
Mm.
And this is where we get to the point where um, we your comment, there's a comment or a statement that you made that I think that does really put the cherry on top of the full round of discussion, which is government is important. However, we have real problems in government and we need to take back communities for ourselves. So you and I have a very similar sort of background as far as growing up in regional and remote areas of WA, and knowing that without having strong, sustainable communities, we know we're going to have a massive breakdown. And this is where these industries and these corporations have come in and inserted themselves above what the people wanting and what's best for our health and well-being, best for
Yep.
sustainable communities and sustainable practices. Because the thing is, as you said, organic horticulture or organically growing fruit and vegetables, this kind of thing, and putting produce on the table was always about knowing how the whole system works. But now it's completely taken over by ideology and the almighty dollar. So it's not about what's good for the land, what's good for our bodies. It's just about how much we can cash in on the whole cycle or the whole system that's implemented by government.
Well, yeah, I attended a conference. Peter Kenyon's Bank of Ideas held a conference in Pickering Brook in September. It's called Small Town Reinvention Conference, and I recorded a number of interviews at the conference and played them on a 2-hour community radio special in Donnybrook. And one of the people I interviewed was Trevor Whittington from WA Farmers. And he was talking
Mm-hmm.
about how in the Eastern Wheatbelt now, there's something like 25% of the land's been acquired by, corporations. And so the suits are running it. They don't employ local people. They don't even allow their employees to be part of the volunteer fire brigade because they're worried about risk. And they take out the fences and trees and then so they can, aerial bomb the place with poisons. It's a complete failure. And I comment it must, for people out there, must be feeling a lot like the Aboriginal people felt when the first settlers came through, because this is a commercial colonialism and it's
So
destroying
this
the
is
fabric.
foreign corporations. So when you talk about corporation, these are foreign corporations
Well,
coming in and
not
taking over land.
what. Well, whether they're foreign or whether they're Sydney or Melbourne, the effect on locals is the same.
Mm.
It's a loss of private ownership, and it's a private ownership that give
Yeah,
people a vested interest because they live there, and the next generation, I hope,
totally.
to live there. And what's happened, as I grew up in Donnybrook in the '60s, and the talk was all get big or get out, and it sort of made sense. But looking back at it, I now see it. It's all part of this globalist agenda to shift people out of the regions and stick them in these bloody great filing cabinets they're building in the cities. And there used to be, it probably still is, a federal government Department of Rural Adjustment or something, which should be called the Department for Depopulating Regional Australia. But again, we've got to learn from Aboriginal people, and they say country needs people, and it absolutely does. And the cities can't exist without economically and environmentally sustainable rural communities. Now, what's happened? Farmers have been encouraged to get bigger, and that's how they judge their success, is how many neighbours they buy. But every time they buy a neighbour, there's one less member in the football team, and that's what's destroying these communities. And my interest with the tourism side of things is tourism or agri-tourism. And like on the tourist radio programs, we try to tell local stories, but agri-tourism, if it gets people out of the cities talking to farmers again, there can be some change, because the radio tech in me knows that any system, a stable system, needs a feedback loop. And what's happened, the feedback loop between farmers and eaters has been destroyed by the supermarkets.
Absolutely.
In a private enterprise system, if I produce good oranges and somebody buys them, that's all good. And if I produce crap ones, they don't buy them. And when the free market to work needs multiple players at all levels, and then the good survive, and the dodgy ones go by the board. But when has happened where you get two corporations sort of controlling everything under this mad competition policy that we've got, the free market system fails. And so we've got to get back to multiple players. And again, I'm really inspired by Robert Kennedy, and I saw him standing up alongside Donald Trump and saying, when we've got to get back, he said, the Food and Drug Administration in America is corrupt. They've allowed these foods, especially seed oils, onto the market that aren't fit for human consumption. All these foods sold by the corporations, they're not recognised by the human biome as foods at all. And seed oils in particular, which we humans didn't eat until the early 1900s, they are as much, or if not more, of a contributor to obesity and diabetes than the sugar. And an interesting connection there. In 2018, I was introduced to an American nutritionist called Dr. Sina McCulloch, and we had a conversation about food. I was actually introduced to her by people from the Savory Institute, Alan Savory's Savory Institute, about landscape management. And we had this conversation, I think it was the first time I'd used Zoom, and she called it an Aussie's take on food propaganda. And so, I explained my take on what had happened. It used to be farmers would produce an apple or a pear or a potato, and they would sell it. But then what happened in the early 1900s, the corporations figured they could buy that potato at, shall we say, $100 a tonne. They could cut it up thin, they could boil it in sugar, fat and salt, or now seed oil, and sell it as a potato chip for tens of thousands of dollars a tonne. So that gave them money to spend on advertising. And then, so they'd advertise it, and then they developed their branding thing and all this branding bollocks that, the marketers, because the problem is the world's been run by marketers who deal in perceptions, not facts. And it's all driven by marketing. And the marketers have taken over our political system, ScoMo being one of the worst examples of that. And say marketers deal in perceptions, not facts, but facts matter. And what happened with the processed foods, and they were advertised on commercial television, my old employer, and for 30 or 40 years, commercial television was the most powerful communication tool. They could produce one ad and carpet bomb the minds of the population to believe what they wanted them to believe. And that's where we're at. But, what I find so exciting, having worked as a tech in commercial television for a Kerry Stokes, I was GWM for 10 years, which is a Kerry Stokes private company. And, 1988, Kerry bought it, and poor old Kerry spent tens of thousands of dollars on cameras and all this stuff. And now this $5 camera I've got sitting on top of this laptop, probably doing a better job. And so, the technology has democratized the media, and the old school media is fighting a rearguard action with their misinformation bills. But at the end of the day, the truth is getting out.
Absolutely, Barry. I think that when we've talked in the past, we've both recognized that one of the comments that's been put up is that small town culture is vital for building communities. And the
Yep,
thing is, it's not just building communities, it's retaining connection. And
yep,
that's where we've discussed this. And I say this as many times as people will listen, is that it, by all design that's been happening behind the scenes by corporations through government, who the corporations own the government, they're the ones pulling the
yep,
strings, writing the policies, and this insane ideology that's being implemented across um, Australia, but worldwide. Let's face it, it's part of WEF agenda, and it's net zero ideology, thinking that net zero is attainable, when more and more scientists that have been suppressed are all coming out saying it's never going to be attainable unless we keep selling our souls time and time again. And which was like, no, we want to work away from increasing our debt. We want to work sustainably towards communities that are stronger and healthier and fitter, not the other way around. We can see the declining state of things. So what do you see in the future is also going to be pivotal, apart from this aspect of social media, where we're going to have a greater connection between the city and the country again? Because we know that through the regions and how voting is going to be cast in WA in March, that it's going to be absolutely dominated by the city regions. And so, how is it that you see that we can get through to a lot more city people? What's really going on? Reconnection to farming, reconnection to food, and why it's so important to have good, healthy, sustainable food on our plates. Because that's the one thing that I see, that especially with the Bovair that's happened in the last week, it's great because that's put it out there to people about what the negative impacts are. But what else do you see is another way that we can be engaging with city people and trying to get them into asking deeper questions about really what's going on?
well, that's a really good question. It's something I've been sort of looking at for a long time, and I think the agri-tourism thing, getting the conversation going again, but it hasn't happened in the way I thought it would.
Mm.
I hate to say it, but I think maybe people are going to have to go hungry for a while to start to realise. You know, I hate to say that, but I'm finding it hard to see any other way. Um, but then again, if Robert Kennedy and Joel Salatin, so I was talking about Dr. Sina McCulloch previously, Joel Salatin has been appointed by Robert Kennedy as an agriculture advisor. And Joel does a podcast with the same Dr. Sina McCulloch that's called Beyond Labels.
Mm-hmm.
And so, America, the land of the free or the not so free, there's still hope, because while Robert Kennedy says that Americans now spend 5 times as much on chronic disease as they do on the military, that ain't good. But the fact that he can talk about it is good. And if you can talk about something, acknowledge a problem, then we can rectify it. And I think this is where the great hope was in the whole COVID con, and the, getting back to Adrian McKay and Russell Broadbent and the Port Hedland motion. Like the Australian government at the moment is like an alcoholic, and until an alcoholic recognises it's got a problem, it can't be redeemed. And so at some point, our government, and this isn't just Labor, the Liberal Party is equally culpable. But there is hope, and that we've got some good politicians, and they're starting to come together. And I think the people, I look at, I don't buy the West Australian, haven't bought it for years, but occasionally I see a post come up, and they're pushing the COVID thing again, and the comments overwhelmingly, you've lost
We're
us,
not
mate.
falling for this rubbish
We're
again.
not
Yeah,
we're not falling
absolutely.
for this rubbish again. And the whole thing, what I find really exciting about the science of the science of the human biome and the science of the soil biology, these fit together. And in that interview I did at the future small town reinvention conference, there was a guest speaker from America, from one of the American states, community foundation, which is a really interesting concept. But and some people might say it's a socialist thing, but the idea of these foundations is that it creates a bucket of money that belongs to the community that they can spend, not reliant on government so much. But they were talking about how in the country towns in America, the kids all go away, but there had been a sense of community, and so they had provision for people in their will to leave money to a community foundation, so it stays in that community, the money. And because what's happened, and so they're encouraging people to think of their community as the same way as they think of the child in their will. And we've got to take the country back off the corporations. This is what's trashing the joint. And you talk about this climate change thing. So we've got corporations buying up farmland here to be, carbon farms, which is bollocks, because they've got this idea that they can rewild, which means they shut it all up and it's all going to be fine and dandy, but it ain't, because as the Aboriginal people say, country needs people. And the Australian landscape evolved through their fire management. And when they were managing the Australian landscape, we didn't have massive dust storms and bushfires. So the challenge is how to operate that within our economic system. And the problem with the energy thing is that we've got an economy that's based on increasing energy. And I've only seen it once or twice, a graph of energy to GDP. And to keep increasing GDP, we have to increase the energy consumption even more. Therein lies the problem. We've got to break that, which means we've got to start producing food closer to where it's produced and not truck it all around the world, because fresh food's only fresh for a day or so after it's picked. And there's the fresh food people is a lie. The Woolworths byline it's built on a lie. There's no such. You can't have fresh food.
It's been in storage for 3 months minimum. Yeah, exactly. It's and it's been exposed to gases that are not actually that good for the human body.
Well, if it's imported, it's got to be treated with methyl bromide. Now, because the whole global free trade thing is about my take on global free trade. It's spreading pests and diseases all around the world. It's driven by cheap oil and virtual slave labor in developing countries. It's neither economically nor environmentally sustainable in the past. No. And we'll get back to, producing food where it's consumed. And unfortunately, we've gone and built houses on some of our best agricultural land, so that's a bit of a problem. And the idea that we can do hydroponics or anything like that is completely at odds with biological systems.
Coming back to what you were saying about how putting money back into community and looking at so that people will pass on money like as a form of inheritance back into the community. Maybe you've also touched on something that would be very good, because as far as I'm concerned, local government should be, I'm going to rephrase that, local council, not government, because they shouldn't be part of government. It should belong to the people as a council. So local council should be those representatives of the people. And from that, we should be reaching out and engendering more communication and connection from between rural communities and city. So just in the way that we adopt and have sister cities from Australia to Japan and other things, why the heck are we not doing that from city regions in Shenton Park, and they can be a sister community to the council in this region and be promoting what's going on in that region and educating people about the issues in the agricultural areas, understanding exactly what's going on with why it's so important to keep merino sheep, and that by getting rid of merino and the wool industry is going to shoot us all in the foot in the next 5 years, because the trend is completely shifting right here, right now, back to sustainable natural fibers. So we know that the human frequency functions on natural fibers like organic cotton or and bamboo and hemp and wool, and by wearing this, it actually enhances our health and well-being. And so they know that by destroying these industries and getting rid of wool, that this is where they'll have to rely on other substances that, they'll just be put in place by corporations saying, we've genetically modified this now, this is what we can use instead. And this is where I think that putting pressure on local councils to say, why aren't we creating sister communities in the city, so that there's enough around to do that, and just say we need to be establishing that, so getting a better connection. I think you've nailed something there. I think that we've joined a dot here where we, instead of worrying about internationally that we have sister cities and communities, that we need to actually have that within our own nation and our own states. I think that's
I think that's a brilliant idea. I'll mention it to Peter Kenyon. You'll probably get a phone call from him.
Perfect. Let's do it. You and I, we're on it.
Because you see,
this is a mission.
The sister city relationships, that's just a jolly for councillors to go tripping around the world at ratepayers' expenses. And
of course it is.
And this is what Radia and McRae's doing so significantly with the Port Hedland motion. Because this is taking it back to the people. And the Charles Massey, who I spoke to earlier, who Alana McTiernan brought to Western Australia, he says a change simply can't come from the top down. It's got to come from the bottom up, because the people at the top have fought to get there and like it the way it is. And this is what Adrian started with the Port Hedland motion. And I think the thing about the problem for councils is that their rules of engagement are set by the state government, which is, really set up to make them to fail almost.
Yeah.
And
totally.
And the councillors can't even speak their mind. The Shire president's the only person allowed to speak on behalf of the council. This is obscene. This shouldn't be the case in a democracy. There's this notion that, we've all got to stand together. And within a political party, that's important. But within a council, that they've got to be able to question. Now, in terms of community, I'm chairman of Donnybrook Baling Up Community Radio. I do a weekly show called Business and Community Roundup, and that's sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. And we talk to local business. We talk to the Shire president. This week I spoke to Charles Covess about the Aligned Council of Australia. I also spoke to Robin and Scott from the
Light
Australia. And, my take, I've coined the term regenerative media, a play on regenerative agriculture. Edge Radio is a part of regenerative media. The Club Grubbery is a part. It's this media that isn't controlled by the corporations. And, the radio tech in me knows that to fix a problem, you've got to address the cause. The problem we have in the Western world is that the same corporations that own big media own big food, big pharma, and big ag. Houston, we have a problem, but we have we have the solution, and I'm really optimistic that Robert Kennedy can break the control, and we can get back to living in a true private enterprise, free market economy.
I think that what you've just said is a profound bit of a breakthrough that we've had here. The lovely Robin has just popped on. Thank you, Robin. And I think that perhaps we already have this alignment and working collaboratively, Edge Radio and all of these independent and very transparent freedom and truther communities and platforms are working collaboratively and have been for some time. I think it might be time pretty soon for us to all get together and start working on this and coming up with solutions ourselves, where we put it back to local council and the community and say, we want you to adopt a rural community as your sister city or your sister council, and we want you to bring those voices forward into your areas. And I don't care really sort of about the politics involved. I think it needs to come down to the grassroots again and sharing stories, as you do, as I do, as Robin does, as everyone sharing these stories, where it's so vital to know that people still have the courage to speak truth after being knocked down and shut down for a long time. So without having the courage to do that, I don't think we would be where we are. I think there's been a bit of a revolution of some sort happen already, and I think that we need to follow through. So maybe we could set that up with Robin and crew and yourself and find out a great little methodology of bringing this together, because we certainly have enough platforms where we can get regional communities connected back to the city, and I think that that's a great way to do it.
Well, Charles Massey talks about the underground revolution with a play on the soil.
Yeah,
But this is what's happening, and at the end of the day, the outcome's going to be decided where people choose to spend their money as far as food
yeah,
goes, and if they can be educated to understand that we've got this system, we've got. And this is a line that Di Haggerty used in the Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities radio documentary. And Ian and Di Haggerty have just they're the West Australian entrance into the Australian of the Year award for the
yeah.
work they're doing in regenerative agriculture. And Di, it's the first time I'd heard this. She talked about we've got we made what my take on it is that we've got a subsidised sickness industry, but Di's line was that we're managing food on the basis of down on price.
Mm-hmm.
That's Coles more down on price. Well, I'm old enough to remember when we said if something was cheap, it was cheap and nasty. Nothing's
That's right.
changed. If it's cheap for a reason.
Yeah, but
And
it's not cheap. That's the thing, is that they make these claims, and yet we know that the farmers are getting this much of their profit. And so it's not cheap at all. It's actually undercutting farmers and destroying entire industries because of this
yep,
corporate minded greed.
yep, yep. And people pay more for a bottle of water than they do for a bottle of milk.
Yeah,
It's economic insanity.
it is pure insanity. But I think that more than anything, I think that it's starting to highlight and put a lot of spotlight over how these ideologies, how they tie into each other. I've been talking to many family members for a very long time about what's going on with this global ideology, and that when you're getting dictated by corporations and companies that have nothing to do with your community, nothing to do with the way that your own society and culture functions, then you're going to be having a sense of extermination or breaking down of your own intrinsic culture and connection. So I think that that's what people are starting to see, and that it's the top down pressure that's going on. Now I think people are starting to wake up and push back. And so all I can say is more and more to my farming family and all my friends out there that are involved in that, you need to just keep pushing back and
Yep,
demanding your rights back, because this government has whittled away at farmers decade after decade, and that getting out there. And I know a lot of farmers that are pretty concerned about what's been going on for many generations on their land and how to rehabilitate the land, and why aren't we investing in that? Why aren't we looking after that? Why are we investing in foreign corporations coming in to create industries in our pristine oceans and on our vital agricultural land that are not fit for purpose, that are going to cause
yep,
destruction and
yep,
mayhem? And so
yep.
they're at the core of it. You can see that Australia's been sold off, and I called us the carbon sacrificial lamb. That's what
Well,
Australia has
and
been.
the whole thing about regenerative agriculture, it's about taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sticking it in the soil, and that means you got to get away from using nitrogen fertilizer. Now, the
Yeah.
wheat belt farmers will say, well, we produce a lot of grain, but we can only do it with nitrogen fertilizer. Well, Haggerty's aren't using nitrogen fertilizer, and the thing is that nitrogen fertilizer, it destroys the soil biology. It releases the carbon.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to get back to working with Mother Nature, and we've got to get more people into regional areas. Now, the trouble with the grains, and they get big money for the grains, and so, but you've got to get animals back into the ecosystem as well. At the moment, they can make bucket loads of money by selling canola. Well, if Robert Kennedy has his way, the market will fall out with canola. It'll only be able to be used as diesel because it's not really fit for human consumption. We shouldn't be
Yeah,
eating this
it's not.
stuff. But
No.
another aspect of taking the animals out of it is the mass plagues. Now, if you're going grain, there's always some grain falls on the floor, on the ground, and then if the sheep come through, they eat it and turn it into protein and that sort of stuff. But that's taking it out of the system. Whereas if the sheep aren't there, then the mice come in. and the mice
Mm-hmm.
plagues come about because of the growing on the ground. And the other thing that Trevor Whittington said is that the action of the sheep, it actually fills in the mouse holes. So, these are wicked complex systems, and it's all being driven by bean canters who can only, understand spreadsheets. They're totally lacking in ecological literacy. They're really dangerous people.
They don't have the capacity to understand the interconnectedness of processes.
Absolutely.
And when you have no application or no experience, and that's why I said
no
one, we've talked about this before, we don't feel that anyone that works in the federal government should have anything less than 20 years life experience. Either you've worked out on the land or in some industry, you've actually done something that more than just been from school to university indoctrination, and then you're just in your ivory tower there thinking that you know it all because you've got a whole bunch of data sets that the government put together that just reinforces the whole ideology that you're trying to plan for these corporations. And when you give them a bit of a across the face or the back of the head, it's a real shock to them that you can see their reality shattered, because when you say to them, have you been out there and seen that land? Oh, no. It's like, I've seen aerial photos. I'm like, yeah, but that was from 10 years ago. Have you seen them recently? So I think that what we're talking about here is how we need to bring back a sense of empowerment from communities, and especially the farming communities, especially from regional areas that still are being overlooked. We talked about this in one of the interviews, that taking the sheep off the land has now created a much higher risk, and there's so much excess fuel on the ground in the Midwest because so many sheep have been sold off and been sent to slaughter. They've been got rid of them because of the export industry. Well, the live export industry is going to be cancelled. So now we have an issue where there's excess fuel for fires on the ground, and that would play right into the hands of those that would love to have fires come out and decimate certain areas so they could come in and take over the land for other industries.
Yeah. The whole, I worked in the federal government Department of Aviation. I spent 2 years on Cocos Island, which is kind of like stop the world, I want to get off. But that's where I came across third and fourth generation public serpents for the first time, because the management was out of Canberra. And these people are on another planet. They're a few more generations down the track. And the voice vote just showed how out of touch Canberra is with the rest of Australia. And the community radio on Cocos, that's where I sort of saw the power of community radio as a communication building tool. I grew up in Donnybrook in the 60s, and there was the local communities, commercial stations functioned much like community stations do now. But what's happened across Australia, the media, radio, TV and print, has largely been bought by the corporations and shut down. And that's where I think community radio, and each state community station's different. So I'm involved with the community radio, which is an incorporated body. My own company, Western Tourist Radio, operates tourist radio stations on 87.6 in Bunbury, Busselton, Dunsborough, Kawarramap and Augusta. And I've tried to build that as a community tool, but because it's a private business, it's been hard to get a lot of support for that, especially in tourism, because the tourism industry is a lot like the Aboriginal industry. Government sees them as important and creates bureaucracies that have a vested interest in failure, because if they ever achieve what they're set up for, there's no need for them anymore. But in saying that, I have no criticism of Aboriginal people whatsoever. And I'm actually more sympathetic than ever to Aboriginal people after the vaccine mandate. I had 6 months of what they've had 200 years of, that same apartheid. I've been thrown out of a pub because I hadn't participated in the vaccine trial. Can you believe that happened in Australia?
Yeah, look, seeing apartheid come back or return to Australia was horrifying, and I did see it coming. However, I think that more and more we're going to see this woke agenda break down bit by bit over the next year. I think that when it comes to the polling stations in WA alone, we are going to be sending a strong message to Canberra and the way that WA is always thrown under the bus for whatever agenda they think that is right for us. So all I know is, Barry, I am looking forward to working on this with you and many others about how we get better connections back between the city people and the country folks. So I would like to thank you for joining me today. It's been amazing, as usual.
My pleasure. And the Aligned
And
Council of Australia, watch your space.
absolutely, they do amazing stuff there. Thanks, Barry. And I will be back with more interviews in the coming weeks regarding connecting communities in rural WA, as well as environmental issues representing people that don't have a voice. So thank you. Thanks, Barry. Have a great day.
Thanks, Martine.